Watching recent events unfold, such as the whole disinvitation of Larry Coeja from Origins, such as the huge successes happening in Comicsgate, well, successes and setbacks, with Jawbreakers making over $250,000 on pre-order essentially. It's like watching Gamergate happen all over again in slow motion in a lot of ways. I see a lot of the same mistakes being made on both sides. And there's this failure to learn from the past on both sides that is tragic to observe. I think people could really do with looking back at the history and learning to approach these things in a different way. Not that they ever will, and I'm well aware that I'm going to be preaching to the choir here on this channel, but maybe you can show this to people who are entrenched on either side at the extremes, and it might give them pause, make them think and change their tack a little bit. Fingers crossed. Now, what triggered this video was a conversation I saw on Twitter where someone was saying Gamergate, Comicsgate, sad puppies, it's all the same phenomenon, and then immediately went on to draw a common thread that doesn't actually really exist. So I wanted to attack this in terms of the common threads that I think do exist. So far as qualifications, I wrote the book on Gamergate. I was deeply entrenched in that. I've had a lifelong interest in comics. I have been reading science fiction for as long as I could read, pretty much, and I also won an Origins award, so I've got some vested interest in the Origins. So then, what is the common thread if it's not problematic conservatives up in arms about recognition being given to women and minorities in these kind of nerd spheres, which is what the person I saw seemed to think was the common thread? Well, to start with, that demonstrates to me one of the most common threads across all of these spats, across nerd media, about all of these things: the misrepresentation of the opposite side. I haven't seen the social justice warrior side ever actually deny the things that they're accused of, at least in terms of their overall goal. They seem happy to acknowledge that they use these mediums to propagandize, to evangelize, to proselytize to their audience, and they all seem to be hostile to their audience and not actually want their audience to be their audience in a lot of ways. Not much of that makes particular sense to me, but this misrepresentation that it's all these archly conservative vestiges of the old republic, yeah, that's not what it is at all. At least certainly if you take people on the rebelling side at their word. In Gamergate, people told you it was about primarily ethics in games journalism, censorship as a secondary issue, but way up there, and then issues around this politicization in games and the corruption that was going on in the media, nepotism and cash oriented. And everyone who stood up and said, look, we've had enough of this, was instantly smeared with this idea that they were sexist, racist, misogynistic, homophobic, transphobic, or whatever else you care to mention, just because they didn't happen to like some games that were based along these kinds of themes, or the creators who happen to fit into one of these protected statuses also happen to be giant fucking assholes, or corrupt, or whatever else. That was all ignored. If people had just taken them at their word and tackled the issues that they presented as the issues that they presented, had a conversation and a debate about it, Gamergate would have probably ended in maybe a couple of months. As it was, people are still mentioning it and still battling over it and still claiming that it does other things. That the latest set of accusations, Zoe Quinn has suddenly decided it was anti-Semitic because anti-Semitism has been in the news apparently, and that must be where the money is. So there's that. In Comicsgate, similarly, people were extremely worried about the direction that Marvel in particular was taking in the content of its books, the way that sales were tanking. They appeared to be putting politicization and messaging above profitability, that there didn't seem to be tie-ins to the films, that the comics were unrecognizable compared to the films, and while the films were making money hand over fist, why weren't they also exploiting that to boost the comics and build the comics audience? And criticisms of storylines like the She-Thor and so on, where they just seem to cram minorities or change things for the sake of changing them, or whatever else. It wasn't that they were minorities that was the problem, it was they were bad stories, they were preaching at you. Marvel was trying to sell you propaganda rather than stories. You know, that was the real issue, and they wanted more adventures, better stories, and wanted basically their industry to be healthy and not to cannibalize itself, you know, chasing this tiny activist audience that seemed to be overrepresented amongst creators. How were they treated? Again, as the conservative, sexist, racist, whatever else, as a harassment mob that was going after particular creators or whatever else. Not true. If you'd just taken them at their word, addressed their concerns and so on, we wouldn't be where we are today. Same with the Sad Puppies. People had a concern that it was work with pretensions of literary acceptance that were getting the awards, that it was a huge boost to the possibility of you getting an award if you just happened to fit into one of these protected categories, that good and popular works by authors who happened to be libertarian or conservative or whatever were being passed over. Yeah, and that's appeared to be a legitimate concern, and there were similar problems in the SFWA and people being disowned and getting the 2 minutes hate and whatever else, because of things they'd said decades ago. You know, some greats of the genre started getting erased from history. The bust that was given as an award that was of H.P. Lovecraft was changed. There's been a lot of hate directed towards Heinlein or to Niven and Pournelle. You know, these giants of science fiction writing are getting ignored or torn down or whatever, and not understood in context. So Sad Puppies and everything else sprang up and attempted to address and expose this issue, and rather than taking their concerns on board and addressing them, people doubled down, and the corruption and nepotism in the Hugo Awards became absurd. The whole fuss around Jonathan Ross hosting the awards came off. That would have been good for the genre, good for science fiction, but no, he told some problematic jokes some years ago, so for whatever reason we're now going to disinvite him from doing the awards. It's again and again you see the actual issues going unaddressed and smearing, and because there's such a stranglehold over publicity in the hands of the social justice warrior types, that's the message that most people encounter, that these are harassment groups, that they hate minorities, that they hate women, that they're all, you know, gammon, old white men with red faces, outraged over things. And that's just not the case, but because they have this stranglehold over the publicity and credible sources, that's also what ends up on Wikipedia, which then people writing more articles reference. And this again happened over all of them. You'd see it. Wikipedia has an entry. It links to an article on a biased site that takes it from someone who was friends with someone who was negatively affected by getting negative feedback from one of these movements. So yeah, that's one major common thread, is the misrepresentation. That media stranglehold leads to a big problem on the other side of the aisle amongst these upstart movements, these rebellions, in that conflicts like these often make strange bedfellows. So with Gamergate, Milo was able to come in and exploit Gamergate to boost his own image and standing and status, simply because there was no other media that would take Gamergate seriously and at their word
about what they said it was. You know, even though the SPJ heard them out and thought there was substance to their issues, even though the FBI investigated and found nothing to be worried about, no sign that it actually was a harassment movement, and the same with the Women Action Media report. In spite of all that, nobody in the mainstream media really would give Gamergate the time of day or listen to what they said and asserted that their concerns and problems that he identified were. And the same thing happened with Comicsgate, and the same thing happened with the Sad Puppies and the Hugos and so on. So if you have this movement and you're trying to get your point across, where can you turn if nobody will listen to you? And unfortunately, it seems to be the kind of genuinely somewhat bigoted and so forth media that is willing to listen because they see mileage in latching onto it. And the people within these movements tend to be fairly tolerant, open and libertarian. When they say, I want all views to be represented, not just yours, they mean it. So they're often very happy to get into bed with Breitbart or Vox Day or whoever, simply to get the publicity. And to an extent that's good and it's helpful and it's useful, but it also makes these movements vulnerable to being exploited, and it validates people's criticism that they're inhabited by bigots or, you know, archly conservative people, even though it's not really true, because those are the only people willing to give you the oxygen of publicity, and they fit that bill. And if you want to stick to your ideals, you have to allow them to join. But then that creates the bias the other way. You know, when you join up, when you link up with bad actors like the Ralph Retort, like Milo, like Vox Day, you're just playing into the hands of the enemy. So it would probably be a good idea to somewhat distance yourself from them if you're trying to present an image that is counter to the one that is being painted onto you. Of course, that might do no good. In Gamergate there was the anti-harassment patrol, there were common denouncements and so on of bad things that people like Milo or Ralph had written, and it did no good whatsoever in terms of reputation. But those are the things that I see as being the common threads, the misrepresentations, refusing to deal with the issues that people present, and unfortunate allies. And I think both sides would do a lot better if they came together to actually discuss the issue that people have and tried to avoid embracing the extremes. Zang.
Oh, pretty fucked up. Pretty fucked up now. Thought she used to be pretty, but now she's just pretty fucked up.